Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for an animated conversation around civic engagement and equity across systems. We are fortunate to have some colleagues here today from Arizona and Utah to talk about their experiences. Again, welcome everybody to the session. Just like to note the code of conduct from Campus Compact in the chat. We will be using the chat today, so feel free to drop in your comments, your questions. We will be monitoring those, your introductions. Feel free to drop that again in the chat where you are from and any questions that you have as we go along this afternoon's chat. So I'd like to welcome you to a storytelling hour of sorts. Again, a tale of two campuses is what we probably should have called this session. And just a little bit about the differences in how a civic engagement is incorporated in a systemic way and a couple of different comparisons for you. So we have with us today some colleagues, again, from Maricopa and from Utah. What we will do is each take a turn introducing ourselves and spending about 10 minutes telling a piece of the story, if you will, levels of engagement and civic engagement and how that's being incorporated or not in different systems across the country. So again, welcome to the session, our storytelling hour. Again, feel free to make liberal use of the chat for introductions and questions as we go along. I will start off. My name is Deanna Villanueva-Saucedo, Associate Vice Chancellor of Inclusive Democracy for Maricopa Community Colleges in Arizona. Maricopa Community Colleges has had a long history of really promoting civic engagement activities across a broad spectrum for many years. And for a long time, we had quite a national presence in this space. So some of you may recall the work of Dr. Bernie Ronan, who unfortunately we lost a few years ago, but he really championed and constructed out of our district office an entire center devoted to civic participation. This has been a number of years ago. Again, a very robust center. It had a bit of a centralized model. So we had staff dedicated to supporting the work of the colleges across the system, but also interacting with a number of national groups, a lot of forums conducted across the state, in collaboration with nonprofit and civic groups. So a really robust portfolio of work. Maricopa Community Colleges, for those of you that don't know, is a system comprised of 10 independently accredited colleges across Maricopa County, pre-pandemic serving close to 200,000 students each academic year. And we cover 100+ square miles of territory in a metropolitan area in Arizona. One of the unique features is sort of the distinct ways in which the colleges, because they are individually accredited, approach this portfolio of work. So again, under former leadership, we had kind of a centralized model, an office dedicated to civic engagement efforts. There's some pros and cons to that, and I think some lessons that have been learned. Unfortunately, we had a change in budget constraints, change in leadership, and that office was eventually dismantled. And I think that leads us to one of the first lessons learned that I will share this afternoon, and that is how you incorporate and embed the work across the system. And sometimes the shortcomings of a very centralized central office model is that it poses it at risk when there are leadership changes or budget constraints, rather than trying to incorporate the work across the system. For those of you just joining us, again, welcome to the CLDE conversation this afternoon. As I said earlier, with a storytelling hour, we are going to have a tale of two community college systems and their approaches to this civic engagement work. My name's Deanna Villanueva-Saucedo from Maricopa Community Colleges. Just a brief recap of my previous comments. Again, Maricopa had a very long history of civic engagement work, active at a national level as well as local level. But this central office model out of our district office did not, in the end, service, I think, as well as it probably could have, versus an approach that really is about incorporating civic engagement efforts across the system and embedding it in the work of the colleges. Most recently, we have a new chancellor on board at Maricopa who's very supportive of this effort. So we are appreciative of his leadership, Dr. Stephen Gonzalez, and willingness to build back up our portfolio of work around civic engagement service learning. So we have just recently, within the last 6 months, created a new unit out of our district office, the Center for Excellence in Inclusive Democracy. This is a new center devoted to bringing together Maricopa's work around the areas of academic freedom, shared governance, DEI, as well as civic engagement / democracy. really trying to de-siloize the work. A large system tends to work in silos. And so the intent of this new center is to bring together in a collaborative fashion all of these 4 buckets of work for our very large system. I think that that will, in the long run, help us create a system-wide approach, which is something that has been lacking. A very large system with 10 independently accredited colleges. Sometimes our colleges approach the work in very distinct ways. And so one of the goals for our center will be to create a sense of alignment with a very similar approach across the system. And what is the system-wide approach to this work? And there are some challenges in that. I think anytime you start something new, you risk moving people's cheese, if you will. And so folks trying to get on board, having some difficulties getting on board, I think those will be some of the challenges in front of us. But again, I think it will create a greater sense of accountability and commitment to the work. One of the approaches of the center will be, again, to bring folks into collaboration around what we mean when we talk about civic engagement or service learning, democracy, all of these core principles for our very large system, creating, again, that sense of alignment, but also supporting the work of the colleges in this effort. My colleague, Dr. Dille, will talk about some of the distinctions in the system and where we've had hits or misses. You know, some of our colleges are very supportive of this work in a robust way, and others that have, you know, budgetary constraints, maybe not so much. So how can we as a center support the work of the individuals actually engaged in these activities across our system? So again, trying to decentralize what had been a very centralized model for a long time. So very new endeavor for us, hoping to restore this portfolio of work in Maricopa, as well as trying to collaborate across the state. Arizona sometimes has some very challenging politics, and we know that some of our sister institutions in the state of Arizona may not have the same level of capacity or engagement or staffing. And so how can we create some collaborations even among other sister institutions to create a statewide presence? That'll be a long-term goal that Brian and I have in the future, but at least we have this on the horizon. As we raise the capacity of our Maricopa colleges to engage in this work effectively with students and with community, how can we be doing the same thing on a regional and statewide level? Those will be my comments. Again, welcome to the session. I encourage you to put those introductions or questions that you have into the chat. I'll be monitoring, and we will conclude with some Q&A, but would love to have those in the chat today. I'm going to turn over the next 10 minutes of time to Dr. Brian Dille, one of our fabulous faculty members at Maricopa, to pick up the next piece of this story hour. Brian?
Hi, thanks. I'm Brian Dille. I teach political science in Mesa Community College, which is one of the 10 colleges in the Maricopa district. And I'm going to echo a lot of the comments that Deanna just said. I was asked to talk about the level of institutional support that we have for civic engagement work. I've been teaching in our system for 22 years, so I have a longitudinal perspective on how things have been and how things are now. And they said, make it real. And so here's my attempt to be real. First is to acknowledge that in the past, Maricopa was quite good in this space. As Deanna said, Bernie Ronan was an all-star with civic engagement. He was an associate vice chancellor in rank, and was in charge of the division of public affairs. He had a staff worker named Alberto Olivas, who was also just amazing. And the two of them just did amazing work. And Maricopa engaged in a lot of national leadership, really, in the late 90s and 2000s and even the early teens. A lot of work with Campus Compact, a lot of work with the Kettering Foundation. Maricopa, under their leadership, helped found the democracy commitment and get that going. Looking at our colleges, 3 of our 10 colleges had full-time staff whose entire job was to promote and manage service learning on our campuses. And most of the other colleges had staff who at least part of their job responsibility was to do that. Civic engagement is in our district's mission statement, and it's in all 10 of the college mission statements as well. And then once the democracy commitment was up and running, all 10 of our colleges signed on to that democracy commitment. And I'm particularly proud of Mesa because Mesa acquired Carnegie classification as a sort of uh, a lodestar, I guess, an exemplar. That's what I'm looking for civic engagement. So things were going really well, and that was almost 10 years ago. And then things changed, and Maricopa has not been doing so well in the past decade. A lot of it is the resource issues that Deanna mentioned. We ended up with interim everybody for about 10 years. We had a lot of turnover with our chancellors and our presidents. And as you know, with that comes a lot of turnover in the vice presidents and the deans as people shift around, and nobody really feels like they could take a strategic move because they don't want to bind the hands of whoever has the job behind them. And so there's just a lot of placeholder leadership over the past decade throughout the Maricopa system. As Deanna said, sadly, when Bernie passed away, we lost a great champion for civic engagement, and his position was not replaced, and his job was carved up, and his responsibilities were given to other people, none of whom it was a priority for, because it was just an added responsibility to their existing job. Alberto got headhunted by ASU, go ASU. They have a great center now that he runs, but we do not have access to his talents anymore. And so we just sort of lost the core of our talent base. And as Dan pointed out, we had a centralized model. And so once the center is hollowed out, there's nothing there. Currently, only 2 of our colleges have maintained full-time positions for service learning. A couple of others have positions that are not filled, or have full-time staff who part of their responsibility is to manage service learning. 3 of our college have no support whatsoever for service learning. And then as a result of all of this, Maricopa has kind of stepped away from any national leadership role in this conversation. So there's been much work has been done in civic engagement over the last 8 or so years, but Maricopa has been absent from that, which is kind of embarrassing given our legacy. So where are we at now? Well, the dust has settled. As Deanna said, we have a chancellor who has a contract. We've replaced, I think, 6 of our 10 college presidents within the last 2 years. And with that comes more permanent positions at the vice president, the dean level, as sort of the dominoes all fall and things settle. So we finally have a leadership base that we can move forward with. And as Deanna said, we have our chancellors stood up a new Center for Excellence in Inclusive Democracy. Deanna is providing the leadership for that. And Deanna, as you can tell by listening to her, is one of those talented champions of civic engagement. And so we now again have district leadership in the civic education space that has been absent. And our presence here at this meeting signals that Maricopa is willing and ready to re-engage in the national conversations as we had in the past. So that's kind of where we were and where we are now. We have a lot of good intentions, and Deanna's great strength is collaboration. So we're going to be collaborating within our system, so it's not a top-down like we had before, but also outside of our system in setting up a community of practice with our sister colleges in Arizona, but also again engaging in these national conversations. So what is the lesson that I draw from all of this? Is that administrative support is critical for this work, partly because of communicates a priority, and that communication trickles down, but also that attention brings resources, and those resources are necessary because we live in a world of finite resources, and that includes time. And people have to have the resources to pay attention to the things that are important, and it takes committed leadership to make civic engagement important. And then with that come those resources. I teach world politics, and so I'm reminded with this of a quote from Pompeo, who used to be a CIA director, and in the Trump administration, as America was withdrawing from US leadership, he had a quote that really struck me. And he said that the international order, we can't take for granted, that it did not will itself into existence, and that if we do not maintain it, it will go away. And what the story that I've just told about Maricopa shows that that is true with civic engagement, that the civic engagement efforts don't will themselves into existence. It requires support, it requires leadership, and it requires resources. And so now I will say that the individual faculty who are committed to this will continue to work in their little corners. But if we want institutional impact, it's going to require that kind of commitment. So that's my story. I'll turn the time back over to Deanna for whoever's next.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate your candid comments. So a couple of lessons learned that hopefully will give all of you as participants food for thought. Where is this work anchored in the institution? I think that is really a question that needs to be considered carefully, and what kind of institutional support and leadership sort of anchors the work across the system. Where is the work embedded? To Brian's point, that we have very scattered examples of excellence. How can we leverage that into a more collaborative system-wide effort? So again, hopefully this is food for thought for you all as you hear our tale. I'm going to turn the next part of the story hour over to our colleagues from Utah who have another institutional perspective on this issue. David, I will let you go first.
Thank you, Deanna. Hello, everyone. I'm David Hubert. I'm the Associate Provost for Learning Advancement at Salt Lake Community College. And I like to tell people I have the best job in higher education. I've been in this role for about 7-8 years now, and I have responsibility for our general education program, our open educational resources, our e-portfolio initiative, our prison education program, our learning outcomes assessment program, and our engaged learning office. And that's where I'm going to focus my attention there. And I kind of want to jump off Brian's comments and say that we really strive at Salt Lake Community College to make sure that there's an institutional partnership with faculty, that our efforts at community engaged learning are not solely resting on the goodwill and hard work of individual faculty. And our faculty are fabulous, but I think the first lesson from my perspective is to build the infrastructure that can be a partner with faculty. So when I originally started my position, I was responsible for study abroad. And then very shortly, service learning moved from our student affairs division into academic affairs, and they decided to house it with me. And I made a decision early on to house service learning, which we now call community engaged learning, with our study abroad program into one engaged learning office. It's headed by a director, Lucy Smith, who's fabulous. She has a master's degree in experiential education, and she's a true partner for anyone who wants to be involved in community engaged learning. So she has a committee that she has developed. It's staffed by faculty. And if anybody wants to develop community engaged learning and have their course designated as a community engaged learning course, there's an application process. There is a rubric, there are standards, and the committee reviews, and if they need some professional development for those faculty to bring them along, we have that as well. And then the course is designated as a community engaged learning course. It is indicated as such in our banner system, so we can keep track of how many students are taking it and so forth. And so she has sort of created a process whereby a faculty member simply has to express their interest in being involved in community engaged learning, and her office reaches out and really helps them along in that process. So the year before the pandemic hit, we had over 5,000 students involved in community engaged learning through designated courses. And I think that's pretty good for a community college that's a commuter institution with less than 14,000 full-time equivalent students. And I owe it to her hard work and the kind of the infrastructure that we've built up over time. The other aspect that I'd like to mention has to do with assessment. So many years ago, we put into our general education learning outcomes a civic literacy and engagement outcome. And it's a sort of a multifaceted outcome. And we put the onus on a number of our courses to help students become civically literate about how change or social change happens or does not, as the case may be, and what issues are being faced by local and state and national communities. And so that has long been in place at our institution. We have developed in-house a rubric to assess that, and we assess it through our ePortfolio system. So that's kind of the synergy in my office. We have ePortfolio as a course level requirement in all of our general education courses. And many of the departments that are designated as civically engaged departments also use ePortfolio in their majors work. So we have an easy system to collect the artifacts surrounding civic literacy and community engagement. And every year we pay faculty, teams of faculty, to assess student artifacts and their reflections, and we produce a report each year. We're involved in the AAC&U Civic Education project this year, and we're quite anxious because we're the same subset of artifacts that we use to assess at the institutional level. We gave those to the AAC&U for the Civic Evidence Project, and we're looking to get that data back so we can sort of validate our in-house rubric compared to the AAC&U work that's being done. So we look forward to that. I think I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over to Julie, who is, well, I'll let Julie introduce herself.
I thought you were going to say I had the worst job in higher ed.
Oh, you're a great partner for us.
So I am Julie Hartley. I'm the Associate Commissioner for Academics in the Utah System of Higher Education, the Chief Academic Officer for the state. So I'm going to talk about kind of the system level efforts and what that means for community colleges like SLCC. So we, as a system, include all of the publicly funded institutions of higher education in the state of Utah. So there are 16. 8 of those institutions offer degrees, and 8 of those institutions offer only technical certificates. So one of the challenges for our system, having all 16 of those institutions together under one umbrella is new. It just happened in the last 2 years through a legislative mandate. And so we've been trying to figure out how to clearly distinguish the roles of community colleges that have a technical education function from the technical colleges per se, and how to incorporate those new institutions in with the degree granting institutions. We've also been trying to address public opinion about higher education in our very, very red state, where there's potentially a lot of rhetoric against higher ed, and trying to convey the value of certificates and degrees to the general population and to our legislators and to the governor's office. And part of that effort involves communicating out the value of an informed citizenry and how civic engagement and democratic learning can be beneficial for the state as a whole. We are also experiencing some welcome and earth-shattering demographic shifts in the state, and are trying to be as inclusive as we can with the shifting student bodies that we have now. And trying to decrease the equity gaps that we have and make the experiences better for all of our students. And then along with that, we're trying to improve completion rates in the state. And one of our key areas of emphasis there is on how we structure our certificate and degree programs. So the civic and engaged learning, democratic learning, all ties in with those various different initiatives. We have 16 different institutions that have signed on to be part of the CDLE work and the affiliated AAC&U Civic Evidence Project. So all 16 institutions, despite their very, very different institutional roles, are trying to identify and assess the various different service learning and civically engaged projects that are going on the campuses, and as part of a national research project trying to gauge the impact of those student opportunities as a way to improve the student experience, but also to communicate the value of higher education to the state. As part of our completion initiatives, we are hoping to be more thoughtful about how we structure degree programs, especially to provide students with high impact practices along their way to a degree, and the types of experiences that have been shown to aid in student engagement and in student completion. And service learning, civic and engaged learning is one of the best researched, I think, of the high impact practices, along with student participation in faculty research. And so we're in the process of examining, as part of our updates to institutional roles and the types of programs that institutions can offer, how we might change how we're asking institutions to structure their degree programs with a better eye toward the student experience and towards building in parts of degree programs that we know will help students to complete. So we would love at some point to have structured our degree pathways in a way that all students can take advantage of these types of opportunities, because it's built right into their degree program. So that's kind of where we are at the system level, making sure that students have equitable access to those types of high impact practices. And we're relying fairly heavily on our 3 institutions that have been part of the AAC&U Civic Evidence Project from the beginning, including David's institution of Salt Lake Community College, to kind of share out what they've been learning with the partner institutions as we start this year really intensively having conversations about what this should mean for all of our students, regardless of whether they're certificate seeking or degree seeking in the state. So we like to be mindful at the system office of what's within our control and what's not. So I appreciated David's comments about not having to rely on one individual faculty member doing everything. We think the system office has the power to convene people and to facilitate conversations on best practices. That's one thing that we can do. We have the power to set policy, which could structure things like what should be included in degree programs. We have some limited power to provide funding, and it's really, really limited right now. We used to have grants and other things that have gone away, that's maybe not even a tool that we have anymore, providing funding. And then the other thing that we can do is to focus attention on certain practices through data and other types of collection of information. And I think that's an area where we could see some interesting things by trying to mark and measure and assess the types of opportunities that students have for civic and engaged learning on the campuses. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Julie. Appreciate that perspective. Participants, feel free to enter your questions into the chat. I have a couple of questions just to start off with. So David, Julie, Brian, encourage you to think about this issue of policy, either at a systems level, state level, your thoughts around any policy considerations that might assist with this issue of equitable access to community-based learning, civic engagement activities, whatever title you use in your area. What might be some thoughts around policies to support the work, again, to increase this idea of equitable access? We have in Maricopa, I'll use us as an example. We have some colleges with very robust staffing and support for these efforts, and others where it's a sliver of someone's time. At a system-wide level, that creates some inequities. Not everybody has access to robust activities or programs. So what are some of those policy considerations that you think might be able to help, for participants on the call to think about in terms of supporting these efforts? David, do you mind if I start off with you, or Julie, what from a Utah perspective?
I don't know. I think I'll defer to Julie on policy issues. I can talk about practices at the institutional level very briefly. So we do track, as I mentioned, we have indicated in our banner system all of our community engaged learning designated sections. So we are able to track, and we are happy to report that the demographics of students participating in community engaged learning exactly matches the demographics of the institution overall. We happen to be the most diverse institution in Utah, slightly edging out the University of Utah across the valley from us. So that's one thing. Another thing, also, echoing back to Brian's comment about support from upper administration, our president and our provost have been here. I've been at this institution for 28 years, and they have both been here slightly longer than I have. So we have a lot of institutional memory, and we have a lot of support for community engaged learning at Salt Lake Community College. So for example, we were concerned about the participation of students in high impact practices and whether that was equitable or not. So our president has made available a fund of money that my office administers. It's from our institutional investment account. And we use that money to target underrepresented students and first generation students so that they can participate in high impact practices when there are financial barriers to that. So we've been administering that since 2017 to diversify the pool, for instance, of students who are able to participate in study abroad, all of which have community engaged learning aspects to it, and undergraduate research and other opportunities. So that's not necessarily policy, but it's practice at the institutional level.
Great examples, David. Thank you for offering those up. And I appreciate the attention you pay to underserved populations, how to increase equitable access to programming. And obviously that requires data tracking and intentionality, which I think are great hallmarks to what you commented on. Julie, again, from a policy perspective, what are things that would help with this issue of equitable access to these types of opportunities? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a few areas where I think policy could be helpful. David's been involved in some of our painful conversations over the last year or so on updating the general education requirements that are shared across the system. And as he mentioned before, some of the institutions have embedded general education outcomes related to civics and inclusivity, global diversity issues. So we're having conversations now about where that attention should live within our expectations for the general education program, and how to make those the same across all of our institutions for transfer purposes, and to ensure that some institutions aren't building on so many additional requirements that students aren't able to complete their degree programs. So that's one area where we've started some of those policy conversations. A second area, though, has to do with policies around how degrees are structured. And so we've been working quite a bit on trying to align lower division requirements across multiple majors between the various different institutions, again, for transfer purposes. But we have committees of faculty that meet within majors from all of the degree granting institutions that get together and talk about a common course numbering system for their classes, and how to align the program requirements for the various different majors, at least in the first 2 years, to try to streamline transfer and completion for students. We are hoping, as we update the policies around what that lower division alignment means, to reference some of the best practices that David talked about at ensuring that students have equitable access to these high impact practices by building them into the degree pathways, so that students would have at least one of those experiences by default as part of their degree requirements in the first 2 years, and then a second one as, say, a senior capstone project or something along the way. We toyed for a long time with trying to track participation in things like study abroad or service learning projects on the student level to ensure that every student had access to those programs, and that became a data nightmare. But flagging particular classes as providing those types of experiences and ensuring that degree pathways include those classes seems much easier to tackle and take on. So that hasn't been built into policy yet, but we do have a strategic plan initiative around structuring degrees for completion that will have those conversations with the faculty major committees about how to build that into their programs, and including things like hands-on experiential learning experiences within the major. And we do want to ensure equitable access for our students. So we're also paying close attention to how well programs are doing at ensuring student success within those programs, looking at the success rates and disaggregating the data to see which courses are more likely not to help students from underrepresented populations be successful, so we can change that dynamic, and also looking within majors as we do our cyclical program reviews to see which majors are performing less well than others in meeting the needs of students from underrepresented populations. So I think those are 3 areas where policy could be helpful.
Thank you. Those are great examples, Julie. Appreciate your thoughtfulness around that, and talk about embedding the work rather than layering the work on top of something else. I think that's where your comments are really indicative of that. How are these expectations embedded across institutions and across systems, so that you don't have to rely on any one particular staff member, faculty member, personality to champion the work. It just becomes an expectation. So appreciate your thoughts around that. Brian, you've been around a long time. Policies, practices, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Give it to us.
Yeah, I've got 2 ideas. One is to address equity for the students, and the other is to address equity among institutions. For the student one, I'm thinking of like the promise programs that are becoming increasingly active around the country. In Mesa, they have a promise program that MCC gets some students from. Our state legislature just recently did a promise program, although it only applies to the universities. And so giving additional student aid to university students and not giving it to community college students seems to not help equity issues, and also is a pretty poor ROI as well. But the legislature doesn't ask me for my opinion on such things. But what I'm thinking is, in those programs, if civic engagement was wrapped into those promise programs, because they are community-based, and the community is supporting these students through these programs. And so it's perfectly reasonable to have either an expectation on the part of recipients that they engage in some kind of service learning activity, or have an incentive built into the institutions who are receiving those students to support civic engagement and service learning specifically. And then as far as equity among institutions, one of the hardest things logistically, if you want to do engaged pedagogies of service learning or internships or community-based research, is maintaining a database of partners, particularly partners that have the capacity to take students on. And it's a lot of work. And so it's difficult for smaller schools that are strapped with resources to generate all of that. I know in Maricopa, the way we do this is at Mesa, we had quite a bit of institutional support. And so we had student service learning director who created an amazing database. And our district just said, thank you very much, we'll take that, please. And it became available for all of the colleges in the district, which is fine, but it suggests that from an institutional level, or maybe if the state could maintain a database so the colleges didn't have to have that burden, that would remove one of the real barriers that are in place to schools who don't have the same level of resources to engage in this kind of pedagogy. And so that's a policy thing that is kind of behind the scenes, but it would make a real difference.
Thank you for your thoughts on that, Brian. Appreciate it. Again, for our participants, feel free to place your questions in the chat. Some engaged dialogue so far, but we welcome your questions as well. Feel free to make use of that chat function. The language that we've been using throughout our discussion, it is interesting as we dialogue with colleagues across the country, service learning, civic engagement, civic learning, a number of different phrases and terms that are applied to the work. So how is it that this becomes an issue of access, understanding, equity? I know even among our college system, some colleges that have robust service learning, others that focus on civic engagement activities that aren't necessarily part of the service learning portfolio. And so how do we create a kind of a common understanding, or what are the challenges and issues that you have seen in your system? And it leads to some real questions around data tracking. Do we track students that are involved in service learning, community-based learning activities differently from those that are just doing civic engagement activities like voter registration that isn't necessarily associated with the class? I think it lends to some confusion with practitioners across the country. And so I can only think from a student perspective, how is it that they understand where they find their openings and their avenues for engagement? So again, this idea of terminology and what we call things, I think becomes a real source of either assistance or confusion in some cases. So Brian, do you mind if I start picking on you first on this one? Just, thoughts around the terminology that we use.
Sure. It's important because any scientific inquiry requires an agreed upon taxonomy before you can aggregate findings. And so, back in the 1800s, they rode around in boats, drawing pictures of finches because no one, we needed a classification system of some kind before you could engage in biology. Early on, again, I've been teaching in this space for 22 years now. I remember the arguments from 20-ish years ago about whether or not service learning was civic engagement, and that other things didn't really count or was something different entirely. And I think we've moved beyond that as a field, and so we can actually aggregate research findings. But there are multiple pedagogies of engagement. Service learning is one of them, and it is still the dominant one. But there are other pedagogies of engagement. So I guess that's my first comment, is that I think we have made progress. That 20 years ago, this was kind of an argument, and now we're sort of in agreement that there are multiple pedagogies of engagement. And so we can make progress as far as gathering data. Some of the panels this morning were sharing some of that data that is being done.
Thank you, Brian. Julie, David, thoughts on how the language that you use has implications for the work there in Utah, or any sort of challenges, benefits from this discussion?
So for me, the definitional issues impinge on a couple of things. One is tracking, obviously. The numbers I reported earlier, so over 5,000 students involved in civically engaged learning, is only students that are in formally designated civically engaged sections, or you could also call service learning sections of particular courses, so that we can track. But we know that all sorts of students are engaged in what we would think of as education involving outreach to the community. So for instance, a number of our undergraduate research projects that students work on are in partnership with local entities that are consumers of the data that is developed in the undergraduate research. So That's one thing that comes to mind. And the other thing is a threshold issue. For our courses that are formally designated, we had a long conversation about whether that threshold was too high and too intimidating for faculty who are thinking about getting involved in community engaged learning. And so we entertained the notion of having a step in, so a community engaged learning light designation, as a way to encourage faculty to get involved. And ultimately our faculty committee, sort of the advisory board that my director uses, they decided not to go that route. We might revisit it, but it does speak to that issue of definitional cloudiness in this work.
One of the big issues that we've been grappling with in terms of definition at the system level is the inclusion of our technical colleges in this process. So our technical colleges in Utah are different from technical colleges in most other states in that they do not offer general education at all. They're prohibited by law from offering general education, with the exception of institutions like SLCC that kind of have that dual focus. They have a technical college within the college, and so they do offer general education on one side of the house, but our technical colleges proper are not allowed to offer general education. So how do you provide community engaged learning or civic learning or service learning in a welding program with no gen ed? How do you do it in a commercial driver license program or in cosmetology or other programs of that sort? So we're kind of in the early days of drawing the finches of having the technical colleges measure the work that or identify the work that students are doing as part of those programs that are community facing somehow, and trying to create a taxonomy based on the examples that they're able to provide, so that we can come up with definitions and ways of marking those things. And I think that's really our biggest challenge right now is trying to figure out what to do with that slightly different category of instruction that's going on at half of our institutions.
Thank you for being honest about that. Certainly that leads to a different way of looking at issues of equitable access. If you have certain populations that are drawn to that programming, then again, are you creating inadvertently inequities across the system? So I appreciate your thoughts around approaching this in a comprehensive way. Certainly valuable, and hopefully it gives our participants food for thought, different ways of measuring the work and embedding the work. We mentioned earlier in the conversation where the work is anchored. That can be very different from institution to institution. I'd like to get our panelists' thoughts around the sort of the ideal ways in which you see the work being anchored, whether it's service learning in particular, civic engagement in general, that can help this issue of sustainability. As I have dialogued with some of our practitioners and colleagues across the country, and we have experienced, again, a lesson learned in Maricopa about sustainability of the work. And so where do you see avenues for additional sustainability, and where to anchor the work that you think would help this issue of long-term sustainability? Just some general thoughts on that. David, I'd like to start off with you because I think you gave a really good description of how you inherited, in a sense, the work and what you have done with it since, and then we'll go to Julie and Brian.
So I think one of the uncomfortable facts at many institutions is the silo effect and the divisions within an institution between, for instance, student affairs and academic affairs. And that's the case at our institution. I mean, we do have a twice a month meeting where the provost and the vice president of student affairs and all of their direct reports get together, and I'm in that meeting, and we work through issues across that divide. But in our case, the fact that service learning was housed for many, many years in student affairs limited the arc of its potential growth. They were just having it was almost a cultural issue, as much a cultural divide as much as an organizational divide. And they were really having difficulty reaching across and engaging faculty. But when we moved it into academic affairs, it's not simply a situation where you're taking, you know, one box and you're moving it on the org chart to a different space. It's much more than that, because it suddenly gets plugged into all sorts of other processes that student affairs had not been involved in. For instance, the curricular process. So I sit on the General Education Committee. We try to encourage the development of high impact practices in all of our general education courses. So we interrogate and we probe and we ask those kinds of questions. And that was simply not on the table when it was housed in student affairs. The other thing I would say is that we're much more plugged into the faculty rank and tenure process by being over in my area as opposed to student affairs. And so we've updated the language and we've provided much more encouragement in the faculty handbook, which is sort of the governing document for faculty rank and tenure, to participate in high impact practices like community engaged learning. So it seems like such a small change to move it organizationally within an institution. And it is if you're only looking at the org chart, but if you're looking at the culture and the processes that suddenly you're now at the table where you weren't before, it can make a huge difference.
Thank you for acknowledging the org chart box versus culture issue, because I think we've, you know, even with some of those folks on the call today, it really is a substantial hurdle in some cases to bridge that divide, unfortunately. As we start winding down our time, Brian, I'm going to point to you. Any thoughts around where to anchor this work in terms of sustainability? And then I'd like to hear our panelists' last little nugget of advice as we close out today's session.
Sure, and I just want to point attention to Shannon's comment in the chat where she was echoing that the cultural differences are real between those two sides of the house. So I just wanted to echo what I'd said earlier about administrative support being critical, because it provides prioritization and with that resources. So one way that an institution can have sustainability is to have civic engagement embedded in the mission statement of the institution. And then criteria for accreditation, you know, the Higher Learning Commission just has added that. And so if it's embedded in the mission statement, if it's a factor in accreditation, then even administrators who really don't care are going to have to pretend like they do. And that's my definition of sustainability when it comes to bureaucracies, is you have to provide the incentives to act in certain ways. So.
I always appreciate your frank comments, Brian. Appreciate you keeping it real for us today. So Julie, David, Brian, in 20 seconds or less, what would be your golden nugget of advice as we close out our session today around equitable access?
Could I defer that question, because Brett Einen had his hand up and I'm wondering if we could take his question.
Brett, did you have a question for us? We have 1 minute left in our session today.
Yeah, I don't know. We can really talk about it, but it kind of goes a little bit with what Brian just said in terms of thinking about accreditation. I think the question of student learning outcomes and how, you know, I was going to ask a question, but we don't have time to talk about it, but if there was ways in which you know, the panelists or others in the group saw ways to use student learning outcomes and assessment, you know, the curriculum alignment, all that goes along with that, as opposed to segmenting, you know, service learning or civic engagement off in a program, thinking about how does it get embedded across programs. I've seen interesting things done with that. It might be something, a topic for another conversation. So
valuable input, Brett. Valuable input, Brian.
Jump in and say at MCC, civic engagement is one of our 5 institutional learning outcomes. So that is another way to sustainably embed it.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Sophia is giving me the high five. We have come to a close on our time today. It flew by for me. I hope it flew by and was entertaining for you all. Certainly lots to think about in terms of long-term sustainability of the work. A couple of lessons learned, how to embed it across our systems and institutions. Where is it anchored appropriately, which may be different from college to college or institution to institution. But hopefully we've given you some food for thought and you all carry on this work. Best wishes for a fabulous holiday season. I hope you all have a time to rest and rejuvenate as we enter into what I'm sure is going to be an exciting 2023. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you, Sophia, who's a high school volunteer.